Well, thank you for joining us. Welcome to Grace. In our previous lesson, we learned that after being deported to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar, by his men, Daniel and his three companions, names changed to the Syriac or to Aramaic. Now we're called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were sitting, in a manner of speaking, in the lap of luxury, being in Babylon, even though they had no choice in the matter. King Nebuchadnezzar's intention, as we discovered in our previous session, was to groom those three boys to serve in his court. And of course, when he went in search of some people to deport, he deported everyone, but when he went in search for that, he wanted to search out the young men who had the greatest potential. Those who had a lot of knowledge, and those who, as I said, had the greatest potential to serve in his court. They'd been numbered, these three, or these four, Daniel specifically, had been numbered to be among Judah's finest, and as far as intelligence and wisdom were concerned. So that's why Nebuchadnezzar wanted those specifically. And as part of that, of his grooming process, his grooming plan for those boys, they were to eat the same meat and drink the same wine that was being served at King Nebuchadnezzar's table. They were to have only the finest. When Daniel refused to eat that meat, drink that wine, because certain things that were offered them were non-kosher, and Daniel refused to eat something that was non-kosher according to Jewish law and custom. But the Daniel he wanted pulse, as it's called in the Bible, which is vegetables and water to drink only. That's all he would take. And he insisted upon that. Well, they gave him a test, and when they tested it, when Daniel asked for a test for 10 days to see how that would work, of course, what did King Nebuchadnezzar's captain of the eunuchs say? No, you'll be pale and sickly. And he said, test us for 10 days. And he did so. And the Lord proved himself right there, not only to Daniel and his three companions who were already trusting him. The Lord proved himself to Nebuchadnezzar, as Nebuchadnezzar was able to see after that 10 days that these boys weren't skinny and sickly. They were fair and fatter, as the Bible puts it, than all who ate from the king's table. So notice Daniel chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel. None like Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, known again as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the Syriac tongue. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of those four, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. So these boys were really coming along. They weren't better because they had been trained. They were better because the Lord was working behind the scenes on their behalf. And of course, the matter of their diet wouldn't be the only issue through which these four young men, these God-fearing lads, we would call them, would be tested as time went along. You can imagine the jealousy that sprang up in the kingdom, and we know that they had to go through that. The three went through the fiery furnace, and we know about the lion's den. All stories that have to do with the testing from the jealousy that sprang up within that kingdom because of the treatment these young men were getting. This brought us the story of King Nebuchadnezzar's recurring dream at the opening of Daniel chapter 2. As you recall, none of the so-called wise men of Babylon, of the whole empire, were able to tell Nebuchadnezzar what he had dreamed and then interpret the meaning of that dream. And he insisted they tell him what he had dreamed before they give him the interpretation. He knew full well that if they couldn't tell him what he dreamed, he couldn't trust it to be the proper interpretation. So they said, tell us the dream, we'll interpret. He said, no, you tell me the dream and then interpret it, and I'll know it's accurate. So none could do so. And they said, you're asking us to do the impossible. No one can do that but the gods of heaven. And so Daniel knew that, and this was proven to Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel revealed that information, and through Daniel, the Most High God was able to demonstrate the capacity that's resident in his name. Remember, this has always been about teaching Israel the meaning of his name. And now his enemies are seeing this, and how God could put all the capacity resident in his name into effect for his men, for the four boys from Judah, and he could do so graciously. What we've discovered to this point in our studies is that King Nebuchadnezzar's dream was directly related to that fifth and final bucket of wrath that God promised would come upon Israel if they failed to do what they had sworn they had the capacity to do. and that's keep his law perfectly and consistently, not failing in one point. They said they could do that for their righteousness, and they never had the capacity to do that. So those buckets of wrath came upon them, and we've come to the fifth and final bucket. When this bucket is empty, Israel gets her king and Israel gets her kingdom. So the issue as we're studying through the Bible is to see where we are in the Bible as we study through the Bible in relation to this fifth and final bucket of wrath. And you can see that the dream Nebuchadnezzar has is all sitting, the issues of that dream is all sitting within the fifth and final bucket of wrath. So Israel would have to learn this fifth and final bucket, along with the previous four, were all designed to bring Israel to that point of learning not to put any capacity into themselves. They didn't have any in the flesh, no confidence in the flesh, but their total confidence in the Most High God, in what He was able to do for them that they were totally unable to do for Him. That's the issue. So this fifth bucket of wrath, along with the previous four, was to bring Israel to that ultimate realization that they had to make a confession. I called it a law failure confession because they were under the law. The law failure confession was, we didn't do it. We swore to you we could keep it. We didn't keep it. Our fathers before us didn't keep it. And, of course, we know that time's coming up when they'll be really offered a chance to make that confession publicly. They failed to do so. So the only way that Israel could ever become what God's plan and purpose calls for them to become when that kingdom is set up here on the earth would be for God to do something for them, to do something with them, do it Himself, and rather than anything at all that they were able to do for Him. Now, before we get into the details of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream, we know from Leviticus chapter 26 and from the prophet Jeremiah that the 70 years of Babylonian captivity would be directly related and would actually open up the pouring of this last bucket of wrath. The 70-year captivity began that pouring. We know that from Jeremiah. However, that initial 70-year period of Babylonian captivity would not be the only judgment time element, we might call it, associated with this fifth bucket, because King Nebuchadnezzar would not be the only king, and the Babylonian kingdom would not be the only kingdom to serve themselves of God's people Israel. How would they serve themselves of God's people Israel? By possessing the land that belonged to Israel. The key issue is the land. So if you'd like, you can look at that figure, that image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and consider that to be the nations serving themselves of Israel by serving themselves of Israel's land. The land is key here. It was just as Jeremiah had proclaimed in Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 14. For many nations and great kings shall serve themselves of them, meaning of Israel also. It wouldn't be just Nebuchadnezzar. And I'm going to recompense, I'm going to repay those nations, God was saying, according to their deeds. What deeds? How they serve themselves of Israel. And according to the works of their own hands. So each of the kingdoms and nations that would serve themselves of God's nation would be repaid, recompensed, for the harm they brought to God's nation in connection with that land. And each of these kingdoms would be conquered by a subsequent kingdom until that day when God's king would ultimately come to vanquish all remaining opposition to him and to the nation that God promised to make of Abram. So Christ was going to come. This is unknown to them at the time. They were promised a king. They saw that by Isaiah the prophet. But it is these opposition kingdoms that are sitting in this figure that to which Nebuchadnezzar's dream was pointing. And it was through the young prophet Daniel that God was making these things known to opposition king Nebuchadnezzar, who had taken Judah out of their land and brought them into Babylon. So God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to do exactly as God had known was always in Nebuchadnezzar's heart, and that was to possess that land that Israel was sitting on. And that way, God knew that Nebuchadnezzar's desire was to serve himself of God's people and Judah. And God permitted it to take place. He didn't cause Nebuchadnezzar to do it. But knowing what was in Nebuchadnezzar's heart, he permitted Nebuchadnezzar to do it in order to use that as part of that fifth bucket of wrath sitting there so his nation could learn something. So even though God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to do as he had done, God planned to judge Nebuchadnezzar for what he had done. And let's return to the king and his dream here for a few minutes, and then we'll follow it through a little more closely. We see Daniel's revelation of the king's dream in Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 through 35. After which, Daniel gave Nebuchadnezzar the meaning of the dream in verses 36 through 45. So it's in this 15-verse section of Daniel chapter 2 that we find a description of the various nations and the kingdoms that would be involved with Israel's fifth and final bucket of wrath before God's king would come to set up his kingdom on the earth and the kingdom of heaven on earth. First, we'll look as Daniel describes the actual dream. Okay, Daniel, if you know the interpretation, tell me the dream first. And Daniel does so right here in Daniel 2:31. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great, or we might say today, imposing image, whose brightness was excellent, meaning exceedingly bright, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible, meaning dreadfully impressive or frighteningly formidable, we might even say today. The image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream must have been of enormous size. Something that would frighten Nebuchadnezzar so much, to that extent that he had to find out what this was all about. The term great image points us to the colossal rather than the incidental. This was a huge figure in the dream. That image would have been so large and overpowering that it caused Nebuchadnezzar, in his dream at least, to shake in his boots. And he was having the same dream over and over and over. It was a recurring dream. He couldn't stop dreaming the same thing. Now watch as Daniel begins to further describe the components of that awe-inspiring image in verses 32 and 33. This image's head, Daniel goes on to say, was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Now, if you want to have something in Scripture to prove the veracity of the Word, to prove the truth of the Word and that it is the Word of God, all you have to do is go back here to this image, written long before these kingdoms came along. And they came along precisely as Daniel predicted they would. Legs of iron, feet part of iron, part of clay. I imagine King Nebuchadnezzar was listening in rapt attention. Can you put yourself in his shoes for a moment? Here Daniel is telling him every word. In every word Daniel spoke, Daniel was speaking forth what Nebuchadnezzar knew he had dreamed. So he has to be sitting there in silence, maybe with his jaw dropped down, and what in the world is he doing? He's telling me exactly what happened. He knew that Daniel was describing precisely what he had been dreaming. No doubt about it. Daniel wasn't disappointing the king when it came to being able to reveal these things. What Daniel knew had to have come from the Most High God, as no one but Nebuchadnezzar had known what he had dreamed. Daniel was relaying it precisely as the king had seen it, and the king knew it. But there was more to what Nebuchadnezzar kept seeing than an image, as Daniel continues his description of that dream in verse 34. Thou, Nebuchadnezzar, sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Daniel then went on to describe what happened to the image due to that stone in verse 35. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold, representative of kingdoms we're going to see, broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain. The prophets used the word mountain for the word kingdom. The image became a great kingdom and filled the whole earth. Daniel gave a perfect description of what King Nebuchadnezzar had been seeing in his dream over and over again. But Daniel wasn't about to stop there, because King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to know the meaning of the dream. Okay, he knows what I dreamed. Now, what does that mean? What did all those composite features of this great image that he kept seeing, what did they stand for? So Daniel begins giving the explanation in verses 37 and 38. Thou, O king, art a king of kings. There's something special about this Nebuchadnezzar. A powerful king, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power and strength and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand. Nebuchadnezzar had a massive empire, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. So in the figure, in the image, Nebuchadnezzar represented the head of gold. In other words, the head of gold in the image represented King Nebuchadnezzar, who in turn represented the kingdom known as the Babylonian Empire that was now serving themselves of Israel's territory. Babylon being the place to where the people of Judah had been taken. But King Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom would not last forever. It wouldn't be the final kingdom on the earth, because Jeremiah already told us many nations and kings are going to serve themselves of you, Israel. So many nations and kings would be in possession of Israel's property, of the land that God gave to Abram and to the nation he promised to make of Abram. Obviously, there was more to this statue than just the head. So it was precisely as Jeremiah had prophesied earlier. There would be many nations and great kings, great in the sense of being exceedingly powerful and influential, that would come along to serve themselves of the nation that had been God's nation. Nebuchadnezzar would simply be the first in a line of kings to come in connection with the fifth and final bucket of wrath before Israel is brought to the point of confessing, no, we didn't keep the law, our fathers didn't keep it, deal with us graciously. As Daniel would reveal, there was much more sitting in bucket of wrath number 5 that Israel would find sitting on their plate down through the course of time. And they'd have to deal with that as bucket 5 continued to pour. Daniel then went on to tell the king about a second aspect of the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream as we come to verse 39. So as we look back from our perspective, we can see these prophecies. We know about the Babylonian Empire. History knows about that and King Nebuchadnezzar. And we can see if these other things that had not yet taken place when Daniel prophesied these things, if they did indeed occur as history rolled forward. Look at Daniel chapter 2, verse 39 and 40. And after thee, Nebuchadnezzar, shall arise another kingdom. Daniel was saying this before that kingdom ever came about. Inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces, and subdueth all things. And as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. So by this point, in Daniel's interpretation, it becomes obvious that each of the aspects of the image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream was meant to signify a different world power or different aspect of a ruling world power that was yet to come in the future from Daniel's perspective. Daniel went on to mention 3 additional ruling world powers that would come along after the Babylonian Empire had come to an end. In fact, it would be each successive empire or kingdom, ruling dominion, that God would use as his tool of judgment against the former kingdom. As each kingdom was conquered, and Nebuchadnezzar would be, God used that next kingdom to punish the kingdom before it. Thus God would ultimately judge all who were serving themselves of the nation that had been his nation and of their territory, as bucket of wrath number 5 continued to pour itself out. Looking back from our perspective, we can see that there was indeed another power that came along to defeat the Babylonian Empire. It was a ruling power that came along to defeat Babylon again, and it came to be known as who knows what it is? Who can tell me what it is? It was the Medo-Persian Empire that came along after the Babylonian Empire, as represented by 2 arms, do you see it, of silver in the image of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. King Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom would indeed be judged by another empire, the second kingdom, and it would be the Medo-Persian Empire. Let's take a look at what some of the earlier prophets had to say about God's judgment against Babylon, the head in this image, and from whom God would bring that judgment. The following statements made by the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 51, verses 11 and 28, speak specifically to the judgment God had in mind for Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, because they had served themselves of God's nation. Verse 11 states, Jeremiah 51, make bright the arrows, gather the shields. The Lord hath raised up the spirit of the kings of, notice it, who does it say here? The Medes. For his device, God's device, is against Babylon, to destroy it, because it is the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance of his temple. I remember Nebuchadnezzar had raided the temple. So the Lord would be using the Medes in his judgment upon Babylon. It's important to understand that the Lord didn't cause the Medes to go up against Babylon. He simply permitted it, knowing full well the attitudes of those who would come to rule over the Medes before that judgment ever took place. A little later on in the same chapter of Jeremiah, the prophet made this statement on behalf of God in verse 28. Prepare against her, against Babylon is the issue here. The nations with the kings of the Medes, the captains thereof, and all the rulers thereof, and all the land of his dominion. So God telling Daniel what the meaning was of that dream, through that, Daniel was able to relay to King Nebuchadnezzar, there's a kingdom on the way. And it's represented by these two arms. Now, how were the Medes represented by the two arms? Well, according to the prophets, God planned to use the Medes, again, in his judgment upon Babylon, for the way that they themselves had served themselves, we might say, of God's people, of God's nation. Jeremiah wasn't the only prophet to talk about the judgment of the Babylonian Empire that was lying on their horizon at that time. Notice Isaiah's words in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 17. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, against the rulers of Babylon, that is, which shall not regard silver, and as for gold, they shall not delight in it. Another way of saying, you won't be able to buy these Medes off. No way. Nothing's going to stop them. They're going to eventually come against the Babylonian people, against Nebuchadnezzar, and nothing would stand in their way. Notice what Isaiah prophesied in Jeremiah chapter 21, the second half of verse 2, where Isaiah said, Go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media, all the sighing thereof have I made to cease. Now we have a reason for the two arms instead of one arm on the statue. There's two arms on the statue. And now this prophet Isaiah is saying, Go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media. So we know where the Medes were. How about Elam? What's Elam all about? Isaiah was giving a divine prediction of what Elam and Media were about to do. Now, you may have noticed this in this verse that the forces of the Medes would not be the only ones to come against Babylon. Isaiah included Elam in that verse. Go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media. So who was Elam? Well, were Elam and Media one and the same? As you can see on our Medo-Persian Empire map, it was the Persians, not the Medes. Let's see if I can bring that up for you here. It was the Persians, not the Medes, that occupied eastern Elam. So take a good look. If you're watching this by video, take a good look at the map, and you'll see that it was the Persians. Elam was a place. It was the Medo-Persian Empire entirely, but it was the Persians, not the Medes, that occupied Elam. Elam, by the way, was also the birthplace of Cyrus the Great. So Cyrus succeeded his father on the throne, a place there called Anshan, and soon added the province of Persia to his possessions. Cyrus then overthrew the Median king. And in alliance with the Medes, the Persian people and the Medes working together were able to conquer Babylon, thus establishing the Medo-Persian Empire in 539 BC. So while the Medes and the Persians were two different people groups, there was a unity between the two by way of the fact that Cyrus overthrew the Median king, and by the fact that there was an alliance between the two, between the Medes and the Persians, against the Babylonians. So the Medes and the Persians, they were joined together in a common cause, and their strength was found in their alliance together, two people groups. Thus we see the two arms connected to the breast in the image of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The Medes and the Persians of the Medo-Persian Empire. By the way, it was Cyrus, leader of the Medo-Persian Empire, who gave permission to the Jews at the end of that 70-year Babylonian captivity, because he conquered Babylon, to go back to their land. You can now go back to your land. And that was the capture, or the conquering of the Babylonian Empire put an end to that 70-year captivity. And some of the Jews did return. The temple was rebuilt, but not all of them. They weren't regathered supernaturally by God, as they will be in time future by the angelic host when Christ returns. But some of them did return to the land. Now, there's something of interest as far as the territory of Elam and the people of Persia are concerned that we need to make mention of here. Let's see if we can find it here. Okay, going back to the days of Noah, we find that Elam, and I want to go back to the map, we find that Elam and the people of Persia are concerned. There's a concern here, and we need to mention it so you folks know what it's about. It's the story of the history of that part of the globe. Going back to the days of Noah, as I said, we find that Elam was the son of Shem. So I'm taking you way back. Elam was the son of Shem and the grandson of Noah. It was the descendants of Elam that established this nation of Elam in what today is known as the southwestern portion of Iran. This is why when we see Persia, the name Persia, mentioned in the Bible, we think of Iran, because Persia is modern-day Iran. There's a prophecy about Persia and about Persia's antagonistic stance against Israel in the Bible, but hopefully you can now see that that antagonistic stance way back there was not a past stance. The antagonistic stance of Iran, Persia, or Iran to Israel today is not a current antagonistic stance only today. It has been in place since since these people occupying these territories were serving themselves of Israel way back in Cyrus's day. So the Medo-Persian Empire, like the Babylonian Empire before it, would become specific targets of God's judgments for the way that they serve themselves of God's nation, particularly the way they serve themselves of God's land that He had given to them, to Israel. Don't think so much in terms of the names with these different groups or nations, but think more in terms of the territories, those peoples who were occupying those territories in time past. Think of the territory itself. So the names might change down through time. There may be different names, and they may take on different names because they're under different rulership. And now it's a different kingdom. But it's the same attitude they have in those nations, whoever they may be, in those outlying areas that are serving themselves, are doing so even as we speak. Because as the Bible tells us, God gave that land to Israel. So forget the names for the time being. Think of the territories. The names have changed, but the attitudes of the people groups within those territories, even today, have not changed at all. The anti-Semitic, we'd say, attitude remains the same. And as we're well aware, we need to keep in mind what we learned in earlier lessons. The land is the major issue in God's program with Israel. Why? That land had been His home, God's home, prior to the refashioning of the earth, so it could sustain the creature through whom God plans to reclaim it. Satan's contention with the Most High God has always been centered in that territory called Eden, and in Israel's right to that territory. So regardless of the nations, the names of the nations in that land, it is about the opposition of those nations, whatever they happen to be called, to the nation to whom God gave that land. Okay, from King Nebuchadnezzar all the way down to the 10 toes of the image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the issue remains the same. It's about the various people groups or nations that have stood and will continue to stand in opposition to the right of the Jewish people to be in that land in the first place. That land has been Satan's battleground from the time that God set up His throne in the third heaven, having departed what had been known as His house, the place from which He ruled over the angelic host of the universe in time past. So in a very real sense, the image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream represents the ruling powers, the nations, the kings, the people groups in the land who would be doing Satan's bidding down through the course of time in his conflict with God over that land and the right to that land. As part of God's wrath against the nation that turned against Him, namely Israel, the wrath sitting in bucket of wrath number 5, God permitted those opposition nations and kings to serve themselves of His nation until such time as God's King, the Lord Jesus Christ, returns to the earth to set up the kingdom of God on earth, the kingdom of heaven on earth, and establish the nation God promised to make of Abram in the land that God had given to Abram centuries earlier. Also, keep in mind the law of second reference that we talked about in our previous lesson. While there was a partial fulfillment of God's judgment that took place in time past against the rulers of those territories who were antagonistic towards Israel's right to the land, there was a completed aspect of that judgment that was yet to be fulfilled. And that completed aspect will be fulfilled when Jesus Christ returns. Those territories and the entirety of Eden will belong to the nation to whom God had given it long ago. And so the attitudes of the various opposition groups, whatever their names are, in that land, they've not changed down through the course of time. They're anti-Israel having any right to that land whatsoever. The final king to rule over Babylon was a man named Belshazzar, King Nebuchadnezzar's son. His name was very much like the name Nebuchadnezzar had given to Daniel. I don't know if you remember that name, but the king called Daniel Belteshazzar. Well, this man is Belshazzar. Just don't confuse the two. Some have suggested that Belshazzar was not a king at all, but merely acting as king in his father's absence. Whatever the case, makes no difference. As far as the story goes, the word in the Bible is king, King Belshazzar. So we're going to go with that. It's the same word in the Hebrew translated king elsewhere. Belshazzar was king. He was the final king over the Babylonian Empire. According to the biblical account, Belshazzar was throwing a huge party. He was going to have a grand time, a big gala event for the rich and powerful in the kingdom. So all the lords, all the princes, everyone, his wives, his concubines, anyone who was of any consequence in Babylon was coming to his great party. There were thousands of guests present for this grand event. In order to impress those guests, guess what Belshazzar did? He ordered that all the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem be brought to the feast, in order that Belshazzar's princes' wives and concubines might drink from those vessels. We will really impress these people. Whatever impression Belshazzar wanted to make on his guests, those of you who know the rest of the story know that a much greater impression was about to be made on those people. Now let's join the story in Daniel chapter 5, beginning with verses 4 and 5, and you'll see just exactly what I'm talking about. Daniel 5, 4 and 5. They drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold, and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Can you imagine Belshazzar's amazement and the fear that had to come over that guy? What would your reaction be to seeing a hand unattached to an arm, much less a body, suddenly appear and begin writing on your dining room wall, guest present or not? I would imagine more than a few of us would just faint from fright. We'd faint dead away right there in the spot. We know that the strange sight of the writing fingers affected Belshazzar in a grand manner by Daniel's statement in Daniel chapter 5, verse 6. Then the king's countenance was changed, I imagine, and his thoughts troubled him so that the joints of his loins were loosed. He could no longer stand. This guy was falling apart. And his knees smote one against the other. We'd say, you could hear his knees knocking. King Belshazzar was frightened out of his wits. Verse 7 continues the story. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. He's offering just about everything he's got. Is it not amazing that King Belshazzar was asking for the same people his father had sought out when his father Nebuchadnezzar wanted to know the meaning of his dream? Now his son is seeking these same so-called wise men of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar learned, as we well know now, that the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans were of no help whatsoever when it came to providing the answers that he needed. The only one who was able to provide those answers to King Nebuchadnezzar was the Most High God, and he did so through Daniel. Now Daniel is available for Belshazzar. Daniel's there. He's right there in the kingdom. But King Belshazzar is seeking the same group of wise men, so-called, who've been of no help to his father. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it? You'd think he would have learned. What do you suppose was the outcome of Belshazzar seeking those same so-called wise men? Well, the outcome is recorded for us in chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. We would say astonished today, the same perplexed, dumbfounded. They expected an answer. So after the son comes to power, they're seeking the same information from a false source of information. No one knew what to do next. They were astonished. No one, that is, but the wife of Belshazzar, the queen. She recalled how her father-in-law, Nebuchadnezzar, had finally called for Daniel. And she recalled how Daniel had been able to do what all the wise men of Babylon had no capacity to do. Did Belshazzar listen to his wife, the queen? Well, the answer is yes. Fortunately for him, he did. He called for Daniel to appear in his presence. When Daniel drew near, King Belshazzar offered him all that he had offered the so-called wise men earlier on. You'll be third in the kingdom. Let's pick up the story beginning in chapter 5 with verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Put simply, Daniel saying, keep your gifts. Give them to someone else. I don't want them. Yet I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. Daniel couldn't be bought. Of course, the Lord had made it known to Daniel. But before Daniel read the writing on the wall, he revealed the interpretation of the words written by the fingers on that out-of-nowhere appearing hand. He told Belshazzar how his father's heart had been hardened by pride. So he reminds him, before he reveals what was written and what it meant, he's taking Belshazzar in his mind back to his father before him, and how his pride had led to Nebuchadnezzar being deposed from his throne. Nebuchadnezzar, king over the vast Babylonian empire, the king who had had it all, had been reduced to wandering with wild animals, the Bible tells us, because of his pride. Now that his son had come to the throne, Daniel was ready to tell Belshazzar some things about Belshazzar's time on the throne. He begins in verse 22 by speaking of Belshazzar's pride. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knowest all this. He just reminded him of his father. He says, you already knew this. Belshazzar had been well aware of his father's plight. But still, Belshazzar had not learned the lesson that he could have learned, should have learned, from his father's prideful life and what happened that caused that fall from power. Instead, Belshazzar had followed in his prideful father's footsteps, step for step. Listen to Daniel deliver Belshazzar's indictment, in a manner of speaking, in verse 23. But you, Belshazzar, you've lifted up thyself against the Lord of heavens, and they have brought the vessels of his house, the Lord's house, before thee. And thou and thy lords, thy wives and thy concubines, have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, those gods which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified at all. Having thus indicted Belshazzar soundly for his wicked ways, Daniel was now ready to read the writing on the wall, and interpret the words that we see in verses 25 through 28. So let's quickly go there. Here we are. Daniel chapter 5, beginning with verse 25. And this is the writing that was written. Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. So, 4 words. Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And now this is the interpretation of the thing, Daniel goes on to say. Mene, what's that mean? God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Wow. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balance, Belshazzar, and thou art found wanting. Peraz, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Do you see the 2 arms in Nebuchadnezzar's figure? Belshazzar kept his word, by the way. He commanded that Daniel be clothed with scarlet, donned with the robes of royalty. They put a gold chain around Daniel's neck, and he was made the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. But how about the outcome of Belshazzar? Well, Daniel chapter 5 ends in verses 30 and 31 with a short statement about the fate of the final king over the Babylonian kingdom. Here it is. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius, the what king? The Median took the kingdom, being about 62, meaning 62 years old. So at 62 years old, the Babylonian Empire is really coming to an end. This image, by the way, this statement rather, brings us right back to the image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The Babylonian kingdom had been judged, and it was shown earlier. The breast and the arms of silver there, and the image formed. They formed a prophetic picture of King Cyrus and the Medo-Persian Empire. However, like the Babylonian kingdom before it, do you suppose the Medo-Persian Empire would last forever? I don't see any heads. I mean, there's none going up and down, none going sideways. No, the Medo-Persian would not last forever either. It would ultimately give way to a third ruling power pictured by the belly and the thighs of brass in the image of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Keep in mind, we're still talking about the peoples of the territory of Eden who stood in opposition to God. While another kingdom is in power, it's the same group of people, basically, under different rulership, who are standing in opposition to Israel's right to the land by serving themselves of that land. What powerful ruler establishing a dominating world kingdom through the conquest of the Medo-Persian kingdom, what powerful ruler came to do that? Can anyone tell me? Who came along after Medo-Persia? Yeah, Alexander. Alexander, certainly. That shouldn't catch us by surprise. Who's not heard of the great military commander, Alexander? That's why he's called Alexander the Great, who established the Grecian Empire. But like the Medo-Persian Empire before it, we have something else to look for in connection with this third world power or kingdom because of the body parts in the image used to depict this third world power. We have the belly, but then we also have the two thighs sitting there in the image. We have the belly, but then we have those two thighs coming forth from that belly, extending forth from that belly. We might ask the question, why would the belly in the image lead to the two thighs in connection with this third world kingdom? Why the multiple body parts? Would the kingdom established by Alexander the Great become a split or divided kingdom? Well, those of you who now know something about history know that indeed to be the case. Bible scholars suggest that the belly, a single body part, is used to picture a monolithic government, meaning a large, or we might say prodigious, an impressive power. But then we have the two thighs. What might they represent? The two thighs would represent a division of that power in connection with the Grecian Empire. But how did that split, that division, come about? History provides the answer. Looking back from our perspective, we can see, wow, God knew what he was doing about interpreting through Daniel that dream. The Grecian Empire, built upon the remains of the Persian Empire, began with a single leader, the well-known Alexander the Great, who died shortly before his 33rd birthday. But by the age of 30, Alexander had created one of the largest kingdoms of the ancient world, stretching from Greece to Egypt and into the northwest ancient India. He was undefeated in battle. And military leaders continue today to say he was one of the most successful military leaders of all time. Why the split then of the Grecian Empire? Well, after Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC, his generals carved out kingdoms of their own. They fought amongst themselves for the kingdom. And they divided it up. As a result of the wars that took place among those generals, two major powers emerged. The Ptolemaic Egypt to the south, you can see that in the green on our chart, which is why Daniel's prophecy refers to the king of the south. When you see Daniel prophesying about the king of the south, you know he's talking about that territory. And the Seleucid Syria to the north, the king of the north, spoken of by Daniel in his prophecies, as you can see on the divided Grecian Empire map. That entire area had been conquered by Alexander the Greek and had been part of the Babylonian Empire. But with Alexander's death came the splitting of Alexander's kingdom. Now, why would there only be two thighs instead of four? Because you can see there were two other divisions there. Well, only the two groups, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, occupied the territory given to Abram. And so they're the only ones that were serving themselves of God's land. The word Ptolemaic, by the way, comes from the name of the founding ruler named Ptolemy I, who had been a close friend and general of Alexander the Great. Ptolemy I took charge of Egypt after Alexander's death. You can see his dynasty there. After Ptolemy I, all the male rulers of that dynasty took the name Ptolemy. Some of the Ptolemaic kings adopted the Egyptian custom of marrying their own sisters. So they ruled with what we might call their sister spouses, those sisters also being of the royal house. As one source puts it, this custom made Ptolemaic political practice become confusingly incestuous. And the later Ptolemies were increasingly feeble. Well, you can see what was happening there. You had the Ptolemaic dynasty to the south, the divided Grecian Empire. To the north, encompassing the greatest portion of Alexander's empire, was the Seleucid dynasty. The Seleucid dynasty was given that name because Babylon was given to Seleucus I Nicator was his name, who had been an infantry general under Alexander. As Seleucus expanded his territories, the Seleucid dynasty came to include all of Alexander's great territory to the north. And you can see what an expansive area that was for the Seleucid dynasty. So Daniel's prophecies include references to the king of the north, the king of the south. And as we look back at the divided Grecian Empire map, we can see why those terms were used. And thinking back to the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, we can now see why the belly, representing Alexander the Great, led to the two thighs, a description of the split in the Grecian Empire into the Ptolemaic dynasty to the south, the Seleucid dynasty to the north. I know this is a lot of history, but it's important to go back and see this figure because we can look at this figure in connection with the final bucket of wrath and see what kingdoms did come about. And where might we be today? We're not in that bucket in any way, shape, or form. While Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was actually split into 4 sections, only those 2 dynasties controlled the territory that God had given to Abram. Now, would the Grecian Empire give way to a 4th ruling power? Good question, isn't it? Did the Grecian Empire last forever? I'm helping you. No, it didn't. A 4th empire would come into play, a 4th kingdom according to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. What did Daniel prophesy back in Daniel chapter 2, verse 40? So let's quickly revisit that passage. And the 4th kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these shall this 4th kingdom break in pieces and bruise. So the 4th ruling power would be strong as iron, as represented by the legs of iron in the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, followed by the feet, a mixture of iron and clay, followed in turn by the 10 toes, as the history of this 5th bucket would play itself out. You may have noticed that with each successive ruling power, the elements used to depict that power became increasingly more strong or hard. For instance, gold is softer than silver. Silver, in turn, is softer than brass. And iron is the hardest element of all. So they go from a softness down to a hardness with the progressive kingdoms. And as you can also see, there's an inverse relationship between the value of each of the elements with the hardness of those elements. For instance, while the value goes down, gold being the highest value, the degree of hardness goes up at the same time. Now, is there a reason for that? Well, gold's more valuable than silver. Silver more valuable than bronze, and yet silver is harder than gold. The same is true as we work our way downward through the image. We know that there is a reason to that inverse relationship, according to scholars, and I have no argument with what they're saying. It's been suggested that the descending value of the metals demonstrates the descending moral fiber, or we might say character, of the rulers and of the peoples as those kingdoms came into play. But at the same time that the moral fiber and character of each of those successive kingdoms progressed downwards, the military might and the stiff-heartedness of the rulers and peoples of those kingdoms against God and against God's nation would intensify. So this is why the inverse relationship makes sense to me. You have degradation on the one hand from a spiritual standpoint, character standpoint, and an intensification when it comes to a hardened stand against God and his nation and the military might of those hardened nations. We now come to the 4th ruling power, or kingdom, that would stand in opposition to God's people, through whom God will form the nation he promised to make of Abram, the believing remnant of Israel in time future. It would be said of all the opposition kingdoms we've talked about thus far, that they all will have served themselves of Israel by serving themselves of Israel's territory. And that's all the territory from the Nile in Egypt all the way to the Tigris Euphrates, the territory of Eden. Also keep in mind that the entire 5th bucket of wrath is about those opposing nations and the specific time periods connected to the final bucket of wrath until the setting up of God's kingdom and the bringing forth of God's king upon the earth. There's a specific time period involved with this 5th bucket, which we'll be revealing as we go along. But for now, you might picture it like this. The head of the image and Nebuchadnezzar's dream, representing Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon and his deportation of the Jews from the land, was sitting at the very top of the bucket. And that was the initiation of the pouring out of that bucket, the 70 years captivity in Babylon. They had been usurping Israel's right to the land. They began that when the 70 years started. The 10 toes of the image were prophesied to be standing at the bottom of the bucket. The final thing before the bucket's done. It's finished. But understand, it's the same opposition nations just bearing different names as they came to be under different leadership, different rulers, governmental structures, and hence different kingdom designations. But it's the same people groups that have been in play in Satan's contention with God over that land throughout the course of history. And Satan's rebellion, his contention with God, is over the land. And the issue will continue to be the land until Christ comes to reduce the opposition kingdoms to rubble, as we might say. That's the fulfillment. Second reference when it comes to prophecy and God's judgment. Fortunately for the people, this special dispensation of Gentile grace, God placed the fifth bucket of wrath that he promised would fall upon Israel on the shelf for a time before it completely emptied out. And we'll be talking about that further in the lessons to follow, as Prophet Daniel is going to fill in more of the details. He's actually going to give us the time periods involved with this fifth bucket of wrath. But as to the identity of the 2 legs of iron, with the 2 feet and 10 toes that are a mixture of iron and clay, hardened, yet at the same time being brittle in terms of cohesiveness, there's been varied opinion among Bible scholars throughout the years. Many point to the 2 legs of iron as being the major empire that followed the Grecian Empire. What empire would that be? That would be the Roman Empire, certainly. The Roman Empire was certainly an empire characterized by the utmost degree of debauchery, we might say. Who hasn't heard of the Roman orgies during that period of history? And as to sexual orientation in that day, even with a relatively recent turn of events in what is considered to be right and wrong in our day, the practices of the people and the leaders of the Roman Empire would probably make our country look like a Puritan nation. So yes, we can see the downward progression of the moral fiber of the Roman Empire in its leadership, and how the diminished value of their culture points to the lesser value of iron to bronze. And as far as the hardness of the iron in contrast to bronze, iron indeed describes the toughness and the brutality by which Rome subjugated the nations around them. John F. Wolford, the well-known prophecy writer, made this statement: "The glory of Rome was built on the misery of its conquered peoples." They were indeed a brutal force to deal with. The Romans made crucifixion of the enemies of the state a normal practice. They didn't just put their heads into the guillotine, they crucified them. They had to hang. So you can see why many point to the Roman Empire as being the 4th kingdom represented by the 2 legs of iron. And they would say, yes, there was a western and an eastern split in the Roman kingdom. Whatever the case, we do know, because there's been arguments against it that seem to have a lot of weight, in my mind at least. Whatever the case, we do know that the final opposition to Israel's right to the land, as bucket of wrath number 5 completes its pouring out upon them, will come from a confederacy of 10 nations. Not cohesive in their makeup, but 10 nations working together for a purpose. And the only solution to their opposition to God's nation will come from the Prince of Peace himself, who returns the rock to strike the 10 toes and put an end to all opposition throughout the territory of Eden to God and to his nation. We'll be talking more about this in our studies to come, but we'll take a look at the beasts that Daniel associated, as he associated different beasts with each of these different empires or kingdoms. But for now, I've decided to spend our remaining minutes in this lesson to answer a question that was raised this week concerning an expression taken from the book of another prophet. This prophet would be the prophet of Israel's 2nd bucket of wrath, the prophet Elijah. How many times have you heard the expression, God speaks to us today in a still, small voice? Anyone heard that? What we need today is to just sit back, be still, and listen. And if we listen carefully, now God can't speak loud anymore, but if we listen carefully, he'll speak to us in a still, small voice. And some people claim to have heard that still, small voice. Well, what about that? I've heard people say, I heard the still, small voice of God. But what did he say? Well, the issue is this. Does God speak to people today in a still, small voice? Is that how God communicates with people in this dispensation? Is that how he communicated with people in a previous dispensation? If so, to whom does he do that speaking? And when? And under what circumstances? If we truly walk by faith, not by sight, as the apostle of the Gentiles, the apostle Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, has hearing now replaced seeing? Why would God speak to some and not to others and whisper? And what's the still small voice we often hear about and many talk about? All about. For the answers to those questions, we need to search the Scriptures in a rightly divided manner. We need to go back very quickly and look over the passage and do so in the context of what's been written. Elijah is the one in mind here. And you might recall some things about Elijah from our previous lessons. There was a great drought in the land in connection with bucket of wrath number 2. No water. The bucket that called for the heavens to become like iron, the earth like brass. Elijah was the prophet, the rain prophet as he's often called, that withheld the rain for 3.5 years. As we move into 1 Kings chapter 18, where we're going to find this statement, we come to the contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Anyone remember that contest? At Mount Carmel? Do you remember that? Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to choose a bullock, dress that bullock, lay it upon the altar that they were to build, then call upon their gods, little g of course, specifically the idol Baal, to answer by fire. Elijah would do the same thing, only he would call upon the Most High God. Well, the prophets of Baal answered Elijah's challenge. They did precisely as Elijah said. They called upon Baal, and they did so from morning to noon, according to the final portion of 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 26. "O Baal, hear us!" But there was no voice, nor any that answered. And they leaped upon the altar which was made. They were not only perplexed, folks, they were angry. And they were more than a little angry, because their God didn't answer. And no matter what they did, they even cut themselves, their God didn't answer. Do you recall how Elijah mocked them? Here it is in verse 27 of the same chapter. "And it came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, 'Cry aloud, for he is a god.'" Either he's talking, or he's pursuing something else, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's sleeping and must be awakened. So he's making fun of these prophets of Baal. He was chiding them for worshiping a god, little g, who could in no way answer them. Well, Elijah built his altar. He dressed the bullock. He laid it upon the altar. And he dug a trench around it. And he had 4 barrels of water poured all over the bullock, and then filling the trench around the altar. And then he called upon the Most High God. And what happened? What did he say? Here it is, 37:38 of chapter 18. "Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that thou art the Lord God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice. It consumed the wood, consumed the stones, consumed the dust, and it licked up all the water that was in the trench. Wow, that's a mighty powerful God. Obviously, the prophet Elijah knew that the Most High God was aware of what was happening, or he'd have never posed that challenge. And he trusted the Lord to work on his behalf and do so graciously. Chapter 18 continues with Elijah slaying all the prophets of Baal. He had them all killed. He killed them. Then what happened? Well, King Ahab got wind of what Elijah had done. And who did King Ahab, what did he do? Well, he, being that doting and dutiful husband that we know him to be, wink, wink, ran and told Jezebel, the queen, his wife, what Elijah had. Well, he's killed all the prophets of Baal. And Jezebel had been relying on those prophets of Baal. So Queen Jezebel became enraged at what Elijah had done. So she sent a message to the prophet. That message is all about what she planned to do for him because of what he had done to them. Listen to her words in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 2. "Then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, 'So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life, Elijah, as the life of one of them that he had slain by tomorrow about this time.'" Whoa, he's given 24 hours, and he's going to die the same way that the prophets he had slain died. Now, after all that the Most High God had done on Elijah's behalf, having proven his presence, having proven his capacity to put his Jehovah-ness, his Jehovah name into effect for Elijah, how would Elijah react to Queen Jezebel's threat? Here it is in verse 3. "And when Elijah, when he saw that the threat on his life, when he saw that, he arose and went for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, and left his servant there." And now he's going to go from Beersheba to someplace else. He was frightened to death. Think about it. After all the Lord had done in his sight, and he had trusted the Lord to do that, he's now frightened to death. He'd witnessed those things the Lord had done on his behalf with his very eyes, and he's scared out of his wits, and he's fleeing for his life. He went a day's journey into the wilderness, the Bible tells us, where he sat down under a juniper tree, and then he asked the Lord to kill him. Elijah wanted to die because Elijah couldn't handle the stress of knowing that Queen Jezebel wanted him dead. This is when the angel appeared to him, and we see that twice. The angel spoke to him. The angel said, "Wake up and eat something." You know, you're not only stressed out, you're passing out from weakness. And the angel fed him, prepared the food, fed him. And Elijah's given to see an angel of God do these things for him. And he gained his strength, and he traveled 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Oreb. Now, this is a particular place. This is the mount that Moses was on. And Elijah went to Mount Oreb, and he went into a cave. Now, consider the context. At this point, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, said, "What are you doing here, Elijah? Why'd you come here?" Elijah explained that after all he'd done on the Lord's behalf for the children of Israel, he felt like he was now all alone. No one there with him at all. Why, they were going to come after him and take his life. You mean after God proving his presence at Hormel and his capacity by being there for Elijah when Elijah called the rain to stop, Elijah was now feeling like he was all alone and God was nowhere to be found? This is the context of the phrase that we're now considering. God spoke to Elijah at that point. And notice what he said in the second half of 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11. And he said, "Go forth, Elijah, and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake." All these things are happening, but the Lord was not in any of these things. Now the verse and expression we've been waiting for sits in verse 12, the very next verse. "And after the earthquake of fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice." Traveling the length of that journey just to hide in a cave from Jezebel hadn't been God's idea. That had been Elijah's idea. In fact, God asked Elijah, "What in the world are you doing here?" But had God not spoken to Moses on that mount and given Moses a great display of his glory? Yes, he had. So I imagine Elijah thought, now I can go there and he'll speak to me that same. I'll be able to see God in action. Then I'll know I'm not all alone. You mean after all God had shown him and all he had seen about God being in action, now he's going and thinking he's all alone? So God passed by, didn't speak a word, passed by Elijah in a spectacular display of glory. Great earthquake, wind, fire, but God wasn't in any of those things. The passage states, in contrast to what happened to Moses, when the Lord passed by Elijah, the Lord said nothing. The expression, a still small voice, is the Hebrew demamah, meaning silence, followed by the Hebrew word dak, meaning a very little thing or a very little way, followed by the word kol, meaning a proclamation. You mean silence can be a very little way to make a very loud proclamation? You bet it can, and that's precisely what happened to Elijah in the cave. Put together, silence, a very little thing or way to make a huge proclamation. You know how we would express that today, folks? God spoke to Elijah by answering him not a word. What had Elijah heard? He had heard the sound of sheer silence, and that spoke volumes to the prophet. Why had he not trusted the Most High God in his present circumstance? That's the issue. The Lord had already proven his presence, his capacity, time and again. Now Elijah wants to hear his voice, so he flees. And God, after showing the wind and the fire and the earthquake, speaks not a word. And Elijah got the message. What are you doing here, Elijah? Go back to work. Go back to work. Everything you've done so far and the success you've achieved has not been yours. It's been mine. I'm the one responsible for that, Elijah. I'm not going to whisper in a little voice, and you've got to really pay attention. And then I'll be whispering throughout, the ages to come so that people know what they're supposed to do and when they're supposed to do it. He spoke not a word, and his silence spoke volumes to Elijah. Get back to work. I've always been there. I'll always be there. Go back to work, Elijah. Elijah got the message. If it's something different from that, folks, then God's word is not complete today, as the word itself tells us it's complete. God has not ceased speaking today and through his word and started speaking to us in a little small voice. God can speak normally. He can speak as loudly as anybody else. Your conscience might tell you something. Your heart might tell you something different. Your head might go along with either one. But the reality is, God's Word is complete today. So He's not choosing some people to give a still small voice. You know, Shirley MacLaine stood still and listened for the still small voice. And she heard the voice, as she states, and the voice claimed to be Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ went on to tell Shirley MacLaine that she was God herself, and that there would be many reincarnations until she got it right, and then she would evaporate into the nothingness of the universe. Oh, glory. And that's the New Age teaching that's rampant today in our society, as Shirley MacLaine listened for the still small voice. The idea, God is not speaking. The reality, God is not speaking in a still small voice. He has spoken volumes, and here it is in the Word of God. We just need to read it, take it in, and let it establish us so that we know the direction we should take in our lives today. Let's send the message there. We'll come back to the prophets, and we'll be finishing up with the prophets very shortly, and we'll be moving to the next stage of Scripture. So let's look to the Lord in prayer.